Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Today we discuss about how Rome designed slave boys for death. In ancient Rome, slavery was not only institutionalized but deeply embedded in the empire's economic, cultural, and social systems. Among the most vulnerable were enslaved boys, often taken from conquered territories, orphaned during wars, or sold by impoverished families whose lives were shaped not for growth or freedom but for service, entertainment, exploitation, and often death. Roman slave boys were viewed as property race in Latin objects without legal personhood. They were commonly bought at slave markets across the empire, including in Delos, Ephesus, and Gaul, where youth and beauty raised their price. Boys were categorized based on their physical attributes and intended uses: domestic service, sexual exploitation, or brutal labor. In wealthy Roman households, beautiful boys, especially from Greece, Thrace, or the East, were groomed as pueri delicati, essentially pampered playthings for elites. These boys were kept in immaculate condition, their bodies waxed, hair curled, and often dressed in fine garments. Their fate was intimately tied to the whims of their masters. Others were trained for performance or physical contests. Some boys were raised specifically for entertainment purposes, including performing in violent spectacles in the arenas. While not officially gladiators, since gladiators required years of training and were usually adult males, young boys could be forced into theatrical mock combats or executions disguised as mythology, where they would be dressed as mythological figures only to be killed in a choreographed reenactment of ancient legends. These were known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, or noxi, those to be executed in public spectacles. Some slave boys served in the imperial palace or in senatorial homes, where they acted as scribes, cupbearers, or messengers. Even there, their survival depended on luck. Disobedience, real or perceived, could mean immediate punishment: beatings, branding, or death. Roman law gave masters nearly unlimited power over the lives of their slaves. Under Ius Vitae Nescisque, the right of life and death, a master could execute a slave boy for breaking a cup, looking impudent, or failing to please. In times of crisis, such as after a master's murder, all slaves in the household could be sentenced to death, regardless of age or innocence. This occurred in the infamous case of Pedanius Secundus, whose entire household of 400 slaves was executed after he was killed by one of them, sparking debate in the Senate, but ultimately affirming the brutal law. Death also came through work. Slave boys assigned to the mines, mills, or agricultural latifundia often died young. In mines, they were used for their size to access narrow tunnels, exposed to toxic dust, collapsing tunnels, and starvation. In mills, they were chained to grindstones in continuous motion. No medical care, no legal protections, no escape. Rome's culture also mythologized these deaths, romanticizing or eroticizing the suffering of boys in poems, plays, and paintings. Petronius and Martial, for example, allude to boy slaves in suggestive ways, reflecting a society that normalized this cruelty under the guise of luxury and sophistication. In the end, Rome designed slave boys not as humans with futures but as consumables for work, pleasure, or spectacle, interchangeable lives meant to serve, suffer, and vanish without memory or mercy. This systemic cruelty towards slave boys in Rome wasn't merely tolerated, it was institutionalized, reinforced by legal codes, philosophical texts, and cultural expectations. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero occasionally preached moderation or kindness, but even their rare appeals for humane treatment were steeped in the assumption that slaves were inferior beings, inherently destined to serve. Slave boys were often subjected to pedagogia, a cruel irony where they were brought up under strict discipline not for education or growth, but for obedience and aesthetic refinement to please their owners. In some elite households, they were taught music, poetry, or languages not for their benefit, but so their masters could display their sophistication through the refined company of elegant young slaves. Sexual exploitation was a dark, normalized reality. Roman law made no provision to protect slaves from rape or abuse. Boys, especially those deemed physically attractive, were frequently subject to sexual violence. Their owners, guests, or even other slaves with power could use them at will. The term concubiness was often applied to young male slaves used explicitly for sexual service. Religious practices in Rome did little to shield these boys either. In fact, some were sacrificed or symbolically offered in cruel rites, most notably during funerals or during imperial ceremonies when human sacrifice, though officially outlawed, sometimes found backdoor expressions. In elite funerals, especially for powerful military commanders or emperors, slave boys could be executed to accompany the master in death, an echo of older Etruscan customs. In amphitheaters across the empire, slave boys became part of the game's culture that entertained the masses. They were sometimes forced to fight animals or reenact tragic myths, such as Icarus plummeting to his death or Ganymede being carried away by an actor posing as Zeus, ending in staged yet real death. These were not performances with actors who walked away afterward. These were fatal, one-time roles. Boys were dressed, positioned, and killed as part of Rome's hunger for spectacle. Despite the brutality, resistance did occur, though it often ended in harsher repression. Some slave boys ran away, though the penalties for recapture included mutilation, branding typically on the forehead with fug, for fugitiveness, or crucifixion. If caught helping one another, even in escape, they were subject to collective punishment. The system was designed to isolate, dominate, and erase any trace of humanity or unity among them. Rome's economy and empire thrived on this machinery of cruelty. The death of slave boys was not collateral damage, it was often planned, accepted, and expected. Their short lives served the pleasure, profit, and pride of the Roman elite. The overwhelming silence about their individual names, stories, or graves testifies to their disposability in the eyes of the Roman world. Yet traces of their existence remain in graffiti, tomb inscriptions, and the writings of a few sympathetic observers, tiny sparks of memory in a world that otherwise sought to erase them. Their deaths weren't just historical occurrences, they were symptoms of a civilization that elevated conquest and spectacle above compassion and dignity. This calculated system of exploitation extended even into how Rome disposed of slave boys. Once they died, in most cases, their bodies were not buried with ceremony or care. Many were tossed into mass graves, particularly common pits outside city walls filled with animal waste, corpses of the poor, and executed criminals. These pits reeked of decay and despair, the final resting place for those society had deemed worthless in life and in death. Rare exceptions occurred when a master, moved by sentiment or desiring to display his generosity, allowed a favored boy to be buried with a modest gravestone. Some of these epitaphs survive and tell hauntingly brief stories. Names like Eros, Felix, or Epaphroditus, usually paired with phrases such as Dulcissimus Puis, sweetest boy, or Bean Marenti, well deserving. These rare markers, however, were more often a reflection of the master's image than the slave's worth. The training of boys for theatrical or sacrificial death became more ritualized during the later imperial period, particularly under emperors like Nero and Domitian, who had a taste for elaborate and often perverse entertainments. In Nero's reign, entire troops of young boys were trained to die in mythological dramas. These weren't just punishments, they were aestheticized, choreographed performances in which suffering was part of the art. The audience, often comprised of Roman citizens desensitized by years of violent games, watched without flinching. Even in their last moments, the boys were expected to play roles. Some were forced to sing, dance, or recite poetry before being killed. Others were dressed in ornate costumes and paraded around arenas or stages. Their execution was not hidden, it was magnified, orchestrated for dramatic effect. Death itself became entertainment, and the dying boy was just another act in Rome's grand theater of cruelty. The psychological impact on surviving slave boys was devastating. They lived under the constant threat of punishment or execution, often witnessing the deaths of their peers. This climate of fear ensured compliance and submission. Boys were taught not to cry, not to question, and not to hope. The Roman philosopher Epictetus, himself once a slave, commented on the emotional and physical violence of slavery. suggesting that freedom could only be found through inner detachment to grim survival mechanism in such a world. The imperial system also relied on deleterious informants among the slaves, ensuring mutual distrust even among boys of similar age or background. A boy might betray another to curry favor or avoid punishment, deepening the social fractures that Rome deliberately cultivated to prevent solidarity or rebellion. As Christianity slowly spread through the empire, some early Christian